Inside the daily grind, on a Monday morning, the espresso machine hissed like a cornered animal. A woman in a charcoal coat approached the counter, her hands moving in precise gestures, but the manager only scoffed. "What are you, deaf? Use your words." No one spoke up. Then a barista in a coffee-stained apron stepped forward, his hands signing to the quiet boy beside him, before turning to the woman. In that moment, her expression shifted, surprise replacing resignation. He smiled with his hands. "Oat milk cappuccino?" She reached into her coat and placed a business card on the counter. Victoria Laurent, CEO, Nextech Industries. He went rigid. That company had stolen everything he'd worked for. Leo Vance was 42 years old, and every morning he woke to the sound of machines, not code compiling or servers humming, but milk steamers and coffee grinders. The peaceful sounds of potential had been replaced by the relentless noise of survival. 4 years ago, he had been a senior cybersecurity architect specializing in network penetration testing. He had designed systems that protected financial institutions, built firewalls that defended hospitals, created protocols that kept families safe. His partner in both work and life had been Marcus Chen, a brilliant hardware engineer who believed technology could make the world safer. They had shared a modest townhouse in the tech corridor with Leo's son Toby, a bright 8-year-old who loved astronomy and asked questions faster than Google could answer them. Toby had always been shy, but his words came freely in the safety of their home. Then came the breach. A home security system manufactured by Nextech Industries, marketed as unhackable, had catastrophic vulnerabilities in its authentication layer. Leo had been one of the beta testers. Marcus had installed the system in their home, trusting the company's promises. On a quiet Tuesday evening, someone exploited the back door. The intruders entered while Marcus was alone with Toby. Marcus fought back. He didn't survive. The lawsuit Leo filed was buried under motions and delays. The evidence he'd documented mysteriously corrupted. The company's legal team was a fortress compared to his grief-fueled determination. He lost his security clearance when he became too vocal about corporate negligence. He lost the townhouse when the legal fees consumed their savings. All he had left was Toby and a rage so corrosive it had calcified into bitter silence. Now he worked the morning shift at the Daily Grind, a neighborhood cafe in a gentrifying district where the tips were unpredictable and the questions were mercifully absent. He lived in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where the hot water was temperamental and the neighbors' lives bled through the walls. But Toby's star charts covered every surface. Hand-drawn constellations, crayon nebulas, a child's attempt to map infinity in a world that had grown impossibly small. Toby hadn't spoken since the night Marcus died. Not a word, not a sound, just silence, thick as cement. Every Sunday afternoon, Leo would count the cash in the kitchen drawer. Rent was due in 9 days. Toby's therapy sessions cost $120 each, and insurance covered nothing. He picked up shifts at a computer repair shop on weekends, fixing hardware for people who had no idea he once commanded 6 figures, coming home with solder burns on his fingers and exhaustion in his marrow. On his right wrist, he wore a leather band engraved with a line of code, while true, protect. Marcus had given it to him on his 40th birthday, back when they still believed skill and integrity were enough. He never took it off, even when the leather grew soft from sweat and wear. If he lost this job at the cafe, there would be no safety net, no emergency fund, no family to call, just him and Toby against a system that had already proven it could erase people like Marcus without consequence. He told himself that if they could just make it through this year, things might stabilize. Next year always felt like possibility, but the universe had other plans. It was drizzling the morning Victoria Laurent walked into the Daily Grind. Not the soft Seattle mist the city was famous for, but a cold, penetrating rain that sent people ducking inside with damp shoulders and irritation carved into their faces. She stood out immediately, tall, composed, wearing a tailored charcoal coat that probably cost more than Leo's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek low bun, and a discreet black earpiece sat in her right ear, subtle unless you knew what to look for. Her face was carefully neutral, the kind of expression people wore when they'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers. She approached the counter and began signing. Her hands moved with crisp precision, ordering a cappuccino with oat milk, no foam. The manager, a middle-aged man named Derek, who measured success in transaction speed, stared at her blankly. Then he laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Lady, I don't know what you're doing with your hands, but if you can't speak English, maybe Starbucks is more your speed." A couple nearby snickered. One man muttered to his companion, just loud enough to be heard. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, something that looked like weary familiarity, like this had happened before and would happen again. Leo was restocking cups near the back counter, Toby beside him with his astronomy notebook, waiting for Leo to finish so they could walk to school together. His son tugged his sleeve, his small hands moving with the fluency they'd developed over 4 years of silence. "She's signing, Dad, like me." Leo looked up, saw the woman at the counter, saw the earpiece, saw the way she held herself with dignity even as people mocked her, and something cracked open inside his chest. He walked over, his hands already moving as he approached. "What can I get for you?" Victoria's head snapped toward him, eyes wide with shock. For a moment she didn't respond, as if she couldn't believe someone had actually signed to her. Then her hands moved, careful and grateful. "Oat milk cappuccino. No foam, please." Leo turned to Derek. "Oat milk cappuccino. No foam." Derek's smirk evaporated. He rang it up without another word. While the machine hissed and sputtered, Toby stepped closer to the woman, his hands moving with the fearless honesty of children who haven't yet learned shame. "You're brave." Victoria blinked rapidly, her composure fracturing. Then she smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and softened the fortress of her face. She knelt to Toby's level and signed back. "So are you." A single tear traced down Victoria's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, like she wasn't accustomed to crying in public. But Leo saw it, saw the loneliness in that single gesture of being understood. When the cappuccino was ready, Victoria reached into her coat and pulled out a business card. She placed it on the counter in front of Leo, signed "thank you," then walked out into the rain. Leo picked up the card. Victoria Laurent, Chief Executive Officer, Nextech Industries. The room tilted. That name, that company, the one that had buried the truth about Marcus's death, the one whose lawyers had made evidence vanish like smoke, the one that had walked away clean while he buried his partner in the rain. Toby was tugging his sleeve again, hands asking what was wrong. But Leo couldn't move. He just stared at the card, the embossed logo catching the overhead lights, mocking him with its pristine corporate sheen. Victoria Laurent had lost her hearing when she was 16 years old. She remembered the explosion, the sharp, terrible sound that came before the eternal silence. Her mother, Catherine Laurent, had been a quality assurance director working late at the Nextech testing facility. Victoria had been visiting after school, sitting in the corner studying for exams when the prototype overheated. The blast killed her mother instantly. It ruptured Victoria's eardrums and damaged the cochlear nerves in both ears beyond repair. She spent months in hospitals learning that the world would never sound the same again, and her father, Robert Laurent, founder of Nextech Industries, spent those months teaching her a different lesson. Power is the only language people respect. Robert raised his daughter to be impenetrable, to never show weakness, to use wealth and control as armor against a world that would otherwise see her as broken. Victoria learned sign language in private rehabilitation but refused to use it in public. She wore advanced hearing aids that cost thousands and spoke with flawless enunciation so no one would guess what she'd lost. She built walls so high that even she forgot what vulnerability felt like. By the time she inherited Nextech at 32, she was exactly what her father had engineered: a CEO who never apologized, a woman who commanded boardrooms through silence more than speech, someone who believed compassion was weakness waiting to be exploited, but loneliness had a way of seeping through even titanium plating. At night, in her minimalist penthouse overlooking the city's glittering sprawl, Victoria would remove her hearing aids and sit in darkness. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was just void. Leo's story was different, but the scars were identical. Marcus Chen had been a senior hardware engineer at Nextech Industries, working on the secure home division. He had been the one to discover the authentication flaw, a critical vulnerability that left a deliberate backdoor in the encryption protocol. He had documented it meticulously, sent reports to his supervisor, demanded they recall the product until the security hole was patched. His supervisor was Julian Vane, Nextech's board director and head of product development, a man who measured success in market dominance and quarterly profits. He told Marcus the findings were inconclusive, that the launch schedule was non-negotiable, that he was being paranoid. When Marcus threatened to go to the press, Vane reassigned him to a legacy project and buried his reports in an archived server no one accessed. 6 months later, the vulnerability was exploited. Marcus was killed. Vane had Marcus's employment records sanitized. He ensured the technical documentation never surfaced in discovery. He deployed lawyers and settlements, and the lawsuit collapsed before it reached trial. Leo was left with a son to raise and a fury so consuming it had nowhere to go but inward. He tried to keep working, but the anger infected every code review, every meeting, every interaction until his employers decided he was too much of a liability. So he disappeared into minimum wage work where no one asked questions and no one expected anything but caffeine and a smile. Before we begin, tell us in the comments from which city are you watching, and at the end, do not forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Leo still remembered the exact moment the alert pinged, 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, 4 years ago, when he learned that technology could lie. He had been working late in the townhouse office, reviewing penetration test results for a client, when his phone buzzed with the Nextech secure home notification. Front door unlocked, motion detected, living room. He frowned. Marcus was home with Toby. Marcus would never leave the door unlocked. Leo pulled up the security feed on his laptop. The cameras showed nothing but static, every angle corrupted into digital snow. The system claimed the door was secure, the windows intact, the motion sensors clear, all green check marks, all lies. He called Marcus. It rang 4 times before someone picked up, but it wasn't Marcus's voice. It was breathing, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone who knew they had time. Then the line went dead. Leo was already running for his car, already dialing 911. Already knowing with sick certainty that he was too late. The police found Marcus in the hallway, where he'd tried to protect Toby's bedroom door. They found Toby under his bed, alive but unreachable, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. The detectives asked Leo how the intruders had bypassed the system. Leo showed them the logs, the authentication failures, the back door written into the firmware like a cancer in the code. They nodded and took notes and filed the report. Nextech's lawyers arrived the next morning with condolences and non-disclosure agreements. The company claimed it was user error, that Marcus must have disabled the protocols himself, that their system was flawless. Leo spent 18 months trying to prove them wrong. He hired forensic analysts who found the vulnerability exactly where he said it was. He hired lawyers who filed motions and depositions. But Nextech had something Leo didn't: an army of attorneys who could make evidence disappear and witnesses recant and judges lose interest. When the case was dismissed, Leo's security clearance was revoked for emotional instability. His reputation became toxic. No firm would touch him. He was the man who blamed his partner's death on a computer instead of accepting tragedy. By the time he took the job at the Daily Grind, he had stopped defending himself. The truth didn't matter if no one wanted to hear it. But the worst loss wasn't his career. It was Toby's voice. After that night, his son never spoke again. Not a word, not a whisper. Not even a scream. The therapists called it selective mutism triggered by trauma. Leo called it another thing Nextech had stolen. So they learned sign language together in the cramped apartment above the laundromat, building a new language for a world that had gone silent. And Leo wore Marcus's leather band like a promise. Someday, someone would pay for what they'd taken. He just never imagined that person would walk into his cafe and hand him her card. Victoria Laurent knew there was a traitor in her company, but betrayal sounds the same as loyalty when you can't hear either. She sat at the head of the conference table in Nextech's glass tower, watching 12 mouths move in the weekly executive briefing. Her hearing aids picked up fragments, quarterly projections, market share, all competitive analysis. But the real conversation happened in the glances between speakers, the subtle nods, the way Julian Vane's lips curved when he disagreed but didn't interrupt. She had learned to read bodies better than most people, read balance sheets. And something in this room was wrong. It had been wrong for months. The numbers told one story. Secure home sales were climbing. Customer satisfaction metrics looked solid. The product line was expanding into new markets. But Victoria had access to data most CEOs ignored: the customer service transcripts, the anonymous employee surveys, the pattern of engineers quietly leaving for competitors. She read every complaint that mentioned system failures, every resignation letter that cited ethical concerns. There were too many coincidences, too many gaps in the technical documentation. Too many questions that got answered with smiles and reassurances and nothing substantial. She had tried to investigate. She requested internal audits. Julian Vane, her father's oldest friend and the company's board director, delivered reports that found nothing irregular. She demanded access to the secure home source code. The development team explained it was proprietary, compartmentalized, secure. She asked pointed questions in meetings. People nodded and agreed and did nothing. It was like punching smoke. The isolation was suffocating. Victoria had built her authority on being untouchable, on never showing doubt, on ruling through calculated distance. But distance meant she had no allies, no confidants, no one she could trust with suspicions that sounded paranoid even in her own mind. Her father had taught her that vulnerability was weakness. He had also died believing everyone around him was loyal. She was starting to understand the cost of that delusion. At night, Victoria would sit in her penthouse office and review security footage from the Nextech facilities. She watched employees badge in and out, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might explain the wrongness she felt. She found nothing concrete, just a visceral certainty that someone was using her company to hurt people, and she was powerless to stop what she couldn't see. That morning in the cafe hadn't been chance. Victoria had been investigating a lawsuit, a wrongful death case that Nextech's lawyers had buried 3 years ago. The plaintiff's name was Leo Vance, former cybersecurity expert, partner killed in a secure home breach. Claims dismissed as user error. She had his case file in her car when she walked into the Daily Grind. She had his address, his work history, his son's medical records showing selective mutism onset the night of the incident. She hadn't expected him to be the barista. She hadn't expected him to sign. She hadn't expected the weight of his grief to be so visible in his eyes when he read her card. But now she knew where to find the one person in the world who hated Nextech enough to tell her the truth. Victoria returned 3 days later with a proposition that proved she was either desperate or insane. Leo saw her through the cafe window before she entered, that same charcoal coat and rigid posture. But this time she wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit stood beside her car, security clearly, though he stayed outside. She pushed through the door just after the morning rush, when the daily grind was empty except for a few laptop warriors nursing cold coffee. Derek was in the back office. Toby was at school. It was just Leo and the woman whose company had destroyed his life. She approached the counter and didn't bother signing a greeting. Instead, she placed a manila folder next to the register and slid it toward him. Inside were documents, technical specifications, encrypted file directories, internal communications logs, and a name written in red ink across the top page. Black box. Victoria's hands moved with surgical precision. I need you to find this file. It's somewhere in Nextech's system. I can't access it. No one inside the company can be trusted. Leo stared at her like she'd just asked him to donate a kidney. He signed back, his movements sharp and angry. You have an entire IT department. Hire them. They work for the same people who are hiding it. Victoria's face remained calm, but her hands betrayed urgency. The people who killed your partner, the same people who are using my company to cover up systematic failures. I think there are more victims, more breaches, more deaths, but I can't prove it without that file. Leo's jaw tightened. He wanted to tell her to leave, to take her folder and her guilt and her corporate conspiracy theories somewhere else. But his hands asked the question anyway. Why me? Because you're the only person who has nothing to lose by destroying Nextech. Victoria's eyes held his, unflinching. And because you're one of 3 people in this city who could actually bypass our security. The other 2 work for me, which means I can't trust them. She reached into her coat and pulled out a cashier's check. She placed it on top of the folder. $50,000, made out to Leo Vance. Memo line, consulting services. That's half. You get the rest when you deliver the file. It's enough to cover a year of your son's therapy, maybe 2. Leo felt something crack inside his chest, not his resolve, but the seal around his rage. She had researched him. She knew about Toby's treatment costs, the medical bills, the counting ritual every Sunday. She knew exactly where to apply pressure. He picked up the check, and for a moment, he considered ripping it in half. Instead, he folded it once and slipped it into his apron pocket. His hands moved slowly, each sign weighted with venom. If I do this, it's not for you, it's for Marcus. And every person your company lied about? Victoria nodded, signing just one word in response. Good. Leo told himself he was doing this for the money, but Toby had other plans. The work started immediately. Victoria arranged for Leo to have remote access to Nextech's archived servers, under the guise of a third-party security audit. He worked nights after his cafe shifts, searching through years of encrypted data while Toby did homework at the kitchen table. It should have been simple. Find the file, take the money, walk away. But Victoria insisted on weekly progress meetings, and she insisted they happen at the apartment because, as she signed with infuriating logic, your son is the only witness who can't repeat what we discuss. The first meeting, Toby hid in his room. The second, he watched from the hallway. The third time Victoria arrived, he walked straight up to her and signed a question Leo had never seen him ask a stranger. Why can't you hear? Victoria didn't flinch. She knelt down to his level, her expensive coat pooling on their threadbare carpet, and signed back with complete honesty. An explosion when I was young. It took my mother and my ears on the same night. What took your voice? Toby's hands trembled as he answered. Bad men. They hurt Marcus. I was scared. Being scared doesn't make you weak. Victoria's face softened in a way Leo had never seen. Silence can be armor. It can protect you while you heal, but it can also be a prison if you forget you chose it. Something shifted in Toby's expression. Not quite hope, but recognition, like he'd been waiting years for someone to tell him his silence wasn't failure. He signed back. hesitant but curious. "Does it get better?" "It gets different," Victoria answered. "You learn to speak in other ways, through your hands, through your art, through people who take the time to listen properly." She pulled something from her bag. A sketchbook with thick, expensive paper. "Your father told me you like astronomy. Show me what the stars look like when you can't hear them." Toby took the sketchbook like it was made of light. For the next hour, while Leo worked on cracking Nextech's encryption protocols, Victoria sat cross-legged on the floor with his son, learning the names of constellations in sign language, laughing silently when Toby drew Jupiter with a smiley face. She didn't perform kindness like charity. She simply met him where he was, in the quiet space they both understood. When she finally left that night, Leo walked her to the door. His hands moved before he could stop them. "Thank you. He hasn't drawn for anyone since Marcus died." Victoria paused, her expression unreadable. Then she signed something that felt like confession. "I haven't laughed like that in years. Maybe we're both learning to speak again." Leo watched her disappear into the elevator and felt the edges of his hatred beginning to blur into something more dangerous, something like understanding. Leo walked into the Nextech tower on a Wednesday morning and discovered that some ghosts still recognize their own. Victoria had arranged everything: a temporary security badge, access credentials for the archived server room, a fabricated consulting contract that gave him 48 hours inside the building before anyone questioned his presence. The guard at the front desk scanned his ID without looking up. The elevator biometrics accepted his fingerprints like he'd never left. 4 years ago, he had walked out of this building in handcuffs after shouting accusations at executives in the lobby. Now he rode to the basement in silence. Just another contractor no one cared to notice. The server room was exactly as he remembered. Rows of black monoliths humming in refrigerated air. The smell of ozone and recycled oxygen. The white noise of 1,000 machines thinking in the dark. Leo connected his laptop to a terminal in the corner and began running the search parameters Victoria had given him. Black box, encrypted, accessible only to board-level clearance, hidden somewhere in the legacy architecture. It took him 6 hours to find the first thread. A subdirectory labeled Field Test Delta, buried 3 layers deep in an archive marked for deletion but never purged. Inside were deployment logs from 4 years ago, dates, timestamps, target addresses. Leo's hands went cold when he saw his own address in the list. Marcus's name, Toby's name, 47 other households, all beta testers for Secure Home, all flagged as surveillance active. The authentication vulnerability wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Leo kept digging, his pulse hammering in his ears. He found design documents authored by Julian Vane, technical specifications for a backdoor protocol that would allow remote access to every secure home system ever deployed. The stated purpose, buried in corporate euphemism, was proactive threat assessment and behavioral data collection. In plain language, Nextech could watch anyone, anytime, through cameras and microphones in systems people had paid thousands to install. Marcus had discovered this. Marcus had tried to stop it. And Marcus had died because someone needed to test whether the backdoor was undetectable, even during a live intrusion. Leo's vision blurred with rage. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't a glitch or an oversight or a tragic accident. It was premeditated. It was murder dressed up as quality assurance. And according to the file timestamps, the program was still active, still collecting data, still watching families who thought they were safe. He copied everything to an encrypted drive. Gigabytes of evidence, communications between Vane and external contractors, financial transfers to offshore accounts. When he finally pulled the cable and stood up, His legs felt unsteady. He had what Victoria needed. He had what Marcus died trying to expose. But now Leo understood something Victoria hadn't told him. If Julian Vane was willing to kill to protect this program 4 years ago, he would do worse to keep it hidden now. Leo was walking out with a death sentence on a thumb drive, and somewhere in this building, Vane already knew he was here. Leo made it as far as the parking garage before Julian Vane proved he'd been watching all along. The elevator doors opened to fluorescent-lit concrete and the echo of distant engines. Leo's car was 3 rows away, the thumb drive burning like a coal in his jacket pocket. He was 10 steps from the stairwell when a black sedan pulled across his path, blocking the exit. The rear door opened. Julian Vane stepped out, 58 years old and perfectly tailored, with the kind of smile that preceded terrible news. "Mr. Vance," Vane's voice was smooth, practiced, the tone of someone who negotiated hostile acquisitions before breakfast. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk before you left with company property." Leo stopped walking but didn't respond. His hand moved instinctively toward his pocket. Vane noticed. "The thumb drive won't help you. Neither will Victoria." Vane pulled out his phone and turned it toward Leo. On the screen was surveillance footage, grainy but unmistakable, of Leo entering the server room 6 hours ago. "This building has cameras and places even the CEO doesn't know about. I've been watching you copy files you have no authorization to access. That's corporate espionage, Mr. Vance. 5 to 10 years? Federal prison." Leo's jaw tightened. He signed with deliberate slowness, knowing Vane wouldn't understand but not caring. Then he spoke aloud, his voice rough from disuse. "You killed Marcus. That drive proves it. That drive proves nothing except that you're a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind." Vane stepped closer, his smile never wavering. "But I'm a reasonable man. Give me the drive, sign a new NDA, and I'll make sure you walk out of here with enough money to forget this ever happened. Your son deserves stability, doesn't he? Toby, isn't it?" The mention of his son's name was a knife between Leo's ribs. Vane let it sink in before continuing. "He attends Riverside Elementary, gets picked up every day at 3:15 by your neighbor Mrs. Chen since you're working. Takes therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays at the clinic on Mercer Street. You've built a fragile little life for him, Leo. It would be such a shame if Child Services received an anonymous report about an unstable parent obsessed with conspiracy theories." Leo's hands curled into fists. Every muscle in his body wanted to break Vane's face against the concrete, but Vane held all the leverage, and they both knew it. "The drive," Vane repeated, extending his hand. "Or I make one phone call, and you lose everything you've worked to build." Again, Leo reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed the thumb drive. 4 years of grief condensed into silicon and rage. He thought about Marcus. He thought about Toby. He thought about Victoria waiting for evidence that would never come. Then he thought about the fact that Vane had made one critical mistake. He assumed Leo had only made one copy. Leo handed Vane a thumb drive in the parking garage, but it wasn't the one that mattered. He had uploaded the real black box files to an encrypted cloud server the moment he found them, routing the connection through 7 proxy layers and a VPN Marcus had built years ago for exactly this kind of situation. The drive he gave Vane contained just enough real data to pass a cursory inspection, deployment logs, technical specs, but none of the communications proving premeditation. Vane smiled like he'd won, pocketed the drive, and warned Leo one final time to forget everything he'd seen. Leo nodded and walked to his car, knowing he had 72 hours before Vane's tech team discovered the deception. That night, Victoria arrived at the apartment after Toby was asleep. Leo let her in without a word and immediately covered his laptop camera with tape. She watched him, confused, until he pointed at the ceiling-mounted smoke detector in the corner. It looked standard, but Leo had spent 4 hours researching Nextech's employee surveillance products. That model had a microphone. Victoria's expression hardened. She signed a question. "How do we talk?" Leo opened his laptop and pulled up a program he hadn't touched in 6 years. A custom interface he'd designed when he first started teaching Toby sign language. It translated ASL gestures captured by webcam into executable code strings. He had built it as an accessibility tool, a way for deaf programmers to write software through signing. Now it would let them communicate in a language Vane's surveillance couldn't interpret. He positioned the laptop so the camera could see both of them, then signed slowly. VANE space HAS space EVERYTHING space BUGGED. The program translated his signs into text on screen. Victoria read it and nodded. Her hands moved in response. WHAT space IS space THE space PLAN ? For the next 2 hours, they built their counterattack in silence. Leo explained through signing that Vane would discover the decoy within days. They needed to go public before he could destroy the evidence. Victoria signed back that Nextech's global product launch was in 48 hours, a televised event where she would unveil the company's new AI security platform. 20,000 attendees, live international broadcast. She would be on stage with a microphone and the world watching. Leo's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria would deliver her keynote in ASL, as she'd done once before at a tech conference. While she signed, Leo would hack into the venue's AV system and overlay the broadcast with audio, not a translation of her speech, but a recording he would create using Vane's own voice, extracted and synthesized from the black box communications. Vane admitting to the surveillance program, Vane ordering the cover-up, Vane threatening witnesses. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she signed HE space WILL space KILL space US. Leo met her eyes and signed back with absolute certainty. HE space WILL space TRY. Leo had 90 seconds to breach Nextech's AV system before 20,000 people watched Victoria commit career suicide. He sat in the convention center's media booth, disguised in a borrowed technician's uniform, his laptop connected to the venue's network through a maintenance port he'd scouted 2 days earlier. Below, the auditorium glittered with industry executives, journalists, and investors waiting for Nextech's CEO to unveil the future. Stage lights bathed Victoria in white as she stepped to the podium, composed and untouchable, in a slate-grey suit. She had insisted Leo bring Toby, had arranged front-row seats where his son could watch. Toby sat between Mrs. Chen and Victoria's security detail, holding the astronomy sketchbook like a talisman. Victoria began signing her opening remarks. Her hands moved with precise elegance, welcoming the audience to a new era of security technology. The teleprompter scrolled with the English translation. Everything appeared exactly as rehearsed. No one in the audience knew Leo was currently bypassing 3 layers of firewall protection to access the broadcast mixing board. His screen flashed red. Authentication required. He typed faster, running the exploit code he'd written specifically for Nextech's security architecture, the same architecture he'd once helped design. 60 seconds. The system pushed back, flagging his access as unauthorized. He rerouted through a maintenance account, buried his signature in legitimate traffic. 40 seconds. On stage, Victoria transitioned to the product demonstration. Her hands described the new AI platform's capabilities while behind her, a slick promotional video played on the massive screens. This was the window. Leo sent the command. The mixing board accepted his override. 20 seconds. Julian Vane sat in the front row, 3 seats from Toby, watching Victoria with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd already won. He had no idea the woman on stage had stopped following the script. Victoria's hands shifted mid-sentence. Instead of describing artificial intelligence, she began signing the truth. This company was built on a lie. The secure home system was designed to spy on the people it claimed to protect. 47 families were surveilled without consent. At least one was murdered to test the system. The English teleprompter continued scrolling the rehearsed speech. The audience noticed nothing, but Leo's program was already replacing the video feed with a single image, the black box directory structure. And then, through every speaker in the auditorium, through every device streaming the launch internationally, came Julian Vane's voice. Not live, recorded, extracted from 4 years of encrypted communications and stitched together with damning clarity. The authentication backdoor is functioning as designed. Target residence breach confirmed. 1 casualty. Acceptable loss for field verification. Dispose of the engineer's documentation and prepare the liability statement. No one can prove intent. The auditorium went silent. 20,000 people heard a dead man's murder, confessed in the killer's own words. Vane's face drained of color. Security moved toward the stage, but Victoria didn't stop signing. She looked directly at Vane as her hands finished the accusation. You killed them, and now everyone knows. Julian Vane was arrested before he reached the exit, but the real justice took longer to arrive. The FBI seized Nextech's servers within hours. Vane's lawyers tried to claim the recordings were fabricated, but Leo had preserved the digital signatures, the metadata, the entire chain of custody. The evidence was irrefutable. By morning, federal prosecutors had charged Vane with corporate espionage, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The other 46 families from the surveillance program filed a class action lawsuit that would eventually dismantle half the company's board. Victoria didn't try to save Nextech's reputation. Instead, she stood in front of cameras 3 days after the launch and signed an apology to every person her father's company had harmed. She announced the immediate termination of all surveillance-based products, the establishment of a victim compensation fund, and her resignation as CEO, effective once she found someone qualified to rebuild the company with integrity. She found that person drinking coffee in a cafe 2 weeks later. Leo had returned to the daily grind, expecting to finish out his notice and figure out what came next. Instead, Victoria arrived with a contract that made him Nextech's chief technology officer and her equal partner in transforming the company into something Marcus would have been proud of. They would build accessibility-first security systems. They would open source their encryption protocols. They would hire deaf engineers and create products designed by the people who actually needed them. It would take years. It would cost everything they both had. But for the first time since Marcus died, Leo felt like the work mattered. The night they signed the partnership agreement, Victoria came to the apartment to celebrate. She brought Toby a telescope, a real one, powerful enough to see Jupiter's moons. They assembled it on the balcony together while Leo made dinner, their hands moving in comfortable silence, building something piece by piece. When they finally got the telescope focused, Toby pressed his eye to the lens and went completely still. Leo watched his son's face transform with wonder, watched him see something vast and beautiful and impossibly far away. Then Toby turned around, his eyes wet with tears, and looked directly at Leo. His mouth opened. For 4 years there had been nothing, just the terrible silence of trauma calcified into armor. But now, in the cold November air, with Victoria's hand on his shoulder and stars burning overhead, Toby spoke. "Dad," one word, barely a whisper. But Leo heard it like thunder, like code compiling after years of errors, like the sound of a door unlocking from the inside. He dropped to his knees and pulled his son into his arms, and for the first time since Marcus died, Leo Vance let himself believe that broken things could still be made whole. Leo learned that the person he hated most was just another victim wearing different armor. True justice isn't found in holding grudges until they calcify into permanent rage. It's found in the courage to communicate with those we've decided are enemies, to sign across the divide, to speak through the noise, to understand that suffering doesn't choose sides. The loudest truths are often spoken in silence by people who have lost too much to waste words on hatred. Victoria taught Leo that broken doesn't mean irredeemable. Toby taught them both that healing has its own timeline. And Marcus, in his absence, taught them all that love persists, even when the voice goes quiet. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of Leo and Victoria's journey? What was your favorite moment? Share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to know which scene hit you hardest: the business card reveal, the ASL code interface, or Toby's first word. On a scale of 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story? And if you loved following each chapter of Sign to a Deaf Woman in My Cafe, then I realized she was the CEO who ruined my life. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications to receive more emotional and inspiring stories like this one. Leave a like if you believe enemies can become allies. Comment which character you related to most: Leo fighting for justice, Victoria trapped by her own company, or Toby finding his voice again. We will see you in the next story, because everyone deserves the chance to be heard.